Solomon's Zeitlands, the rise and fall of the Judean state. Volume 1, Part 2, Section 3. John Hyrcanus. Simon ruled over Judea for 8 chronological years, that is, 144 to 143 to 136. His son John, Johanan, surnamed Hyrcanus, succeeded him as high priest and ruler of the Jews. When John Hyrcanus established himself in Jerusalem, his first action was to avenge the murder of his father and his brothers. Ptolemy realized that he had no real following among the Judeans and retired to the fortress Doc near Jericho, where he had been governor in the time of Simon. Hyrcanus attacked Doc and undoubtedly would have conquered it had he not been restrained by affection for his mother. For when Ptolemy slew his father-in-law, Simon, he had taken his mother-in-law with him as a hostage in case John Hyrcanus should escape his plot. He now took her out upon the walls of Doc and threatened to hurl her down to her death unless John Hyrcanus abandoned the siege. With outstretched hands she, however, pleaded with her son not to weaken on her account, but to make every effort to take the fortress and avenge those dearest to him, and to punish Ptolemy. Despite her appeal, John Hyrcanus would not allow his mother to die, but lifted the siege. This state of affairs carried over the entire summer of 136 until the fall, when the sabbatical year began. Ptolemy now felt free to do as he liked. He murdered his mother-in-law and fled to Zenon, the ruler of the city of Philadelphia, modern Amman. The sources are silent as to whether Ptolemy's wife, the daughter of Simon, was also murdered, nor do we know whether she had children, and if so, how they regarded their father Ptolemy. The Syrian Treaty. With the removal of Ptolemy as a pretender, John Hyrcanus met no further internal opposition. Antiochus the seventh, Sidetes, had made no attempt to avenge the defeat of his general Sendebius by John Hyrcanus. The reason for this was probably his preoccupation with his realm in Syria. However, he did not forget this defeat. In the 162nd Olympiad, or the year 133, at the time of the setting of the Pleiades, that is, in November, Antiochus invaded Judea, devastating the country. He finally reached Jerusalem and laid siege to it. He surrounded the entire city with a rampart and a trench, thus making it impossible for the people to leave. John Hyrcanus, in turn, dug 100 trenches, which he manned with legions of soldiers who made frequent sallies against the enemy. But he was not successful in his attempts to relieve the city from the siege. An acute shortage of food and water developed. He was therefore obliged to order out of the city all the aged and the sick, retaining only those in the prime of life and able to fight. Antiochus, however, did not allow the refugees to pass, so that these unfortunates were obliged to roam about between the besiegers and the defenders, and many perished from hunger. The siege lasted almost a year. In the year 132, when the festival of tabernacles approached, John Hyrcanus allowed the survivors to return to the city. He also asked Antiochus for a truce during the festival. Antiochus not only granted it, but sent animals for the festival sacrifices. This generous act pleased the Judeans and gave them hope of obtaining favorable peace terms. John Hyrcanus sent an embassy to Antiochus to sue for peace, emphasizing that the state of Judea must not be destroyed. Some of Antiochus's counselors urged him to follow the policy of his great uncle, Antiochus Epiphanes, to destroy the Judean state and wipe out its religion. He did not heed their advice. He knew that the suppression of the religion by his great uncle had brought about the Judean revolt, as a result of which the Judeans had become free of the Seleucid kings. Antiochus received the embassy and laid down the terms of peace. He specified that the Judeans surrender their arms, pay tribute for Jaffa and the other cities which they had conquered, and consent that a garrison be placed in Jerusalem. John Hyrcanus accepted all the terms except the placing of the garrison. Josephus says he rejected this last condition because of Judean separateness. Posidonius, most likely, was his source for this comment, which indicates once again that the pagan writers did not fully understand the Judeans of their spirit. The Judeans still remembered in vivid detail the destruction and profanation of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes. Thus, it is fully understandable, without seeking special reasons, why John Hyrcanus rejected the demand to have an army of occupation in Jerusalem. He did offer the 500 talents of silver as requested, and his brother as a hostage. Antiochus accepted these proposals and made peace with John Hyrcanus. Before withdrawing, however, he ordered the walls encircling Jerusalem to be pulled down. Antiochus VII exhibited a genuine talent for statesmanship during his short reign. His lenient terms toward the Judeans were a sign of his political maturity. Though the Judean state was at his feet, and he had an opportunity to take away everything they had gained, even to deprive the state of its independence, he was satisfied with these modest demands. His conciliatory spirit greatly pleased the Judeans, and they surnamed him Eusebius, the Pious. There were, of course, political considerations involved. Antiochus was laying plans for a war against the Parthians to reconquer the upper lands. The siege of Jerusalem had lasted over a year, longer than he had expected. He knew from history that the policy of his great uncle Antiochus Epiphanes had not succeeded. Moreover, he was aware that the Judeans were loyal to their friends. In the civil war between his father, Demetrius I, and Alexander Baelus, the Judeans had stood firm upon the side of Alexander Baelus, their ally. In the war between his brother Demetrius II and Trypho, the Judeans had shown their steadfastness, though it was met with treachery. He therefore sought to make the Judeans his friends and allies, and to secure Syria from disturbance, while he went to attack the Parthians. The mild peace terms may also be attributed to the fact that the king did not wish to incur the displeasure of the Romans, particularly at this time. In the treaty with the Romans made with Simon, the father of John Hyrcanus, They had promised to come to the assistance of the Judeans if they were attacked. When Antiochus the seventh had launched his campaign against John Hyrcanus, the latter sent an embassy to the Romans to renew the alliance and to make a complaint against Antiochus. The embassy was well received by the Senate, and the alliance was gladly renewed. Letters were given to the delegation in which it was stated that the city of Jaffa and its harbors, as well as the city of Gazara, which had been seized by Antiochus, should be returned to the Judeans. The Romans sent envoys to bring about the required restitution. This Roman support for John Hyrcanus was largely responsible for the leniency of Antiochus VII. It is true that the Roman documents quoted by Josephus give the name of the king involved as Antiochus, the son of Antiochus, whereas Antiochus VII was the son of Demetrius II. This probably was simply an error either on the part of Josephus or in the sources which he used. It is reported that when the peace treaty was concluded, John Hyrcanus, in order to pay the indemnity, opened the tomb of King David and removed therefrom 3,000 talents of silver, of which he paid 300 talents to Antiochus Sidetes, using the balance for the payment of mercenaries. Although this account of the opening of the tomb is given by Josephus in 3 different places, it is still open to question. If it was the custom of the Judeans to bury money in the tombs of the kings, why did not King Hezekiah, when he had to pay indemnity to the Assyrian king, open some of the tombs instead of taking gold from the gates of the temple? He certainly must have known there was wealth in the tombs, if there was any. Again, during the Hellenistic period, when the high priests Joshua, Jason, and Onias Menelaus had to pay substantial sums to Antiochus Epiphanes, they removed the holy vessels from the temple, causing great indignation among the Judeans. It would clearly have been more advisable to have opened the tombs of the kings. Josephus's account must therefore be doubted in this respect. In another, however, it is surely correct. John Hyrcanus did use part of the national treasury to employ mercenaries. From the time of Judah Maccabee, the Judean army had always consisted of Judean volunteers. Now the army was reorganized in accordance with the military practice of other nations, most of it consisting of mercenaries, but commanded by native officers. After the conclusion of the peace treaty, Judea remained an independent state, but was a satellite under the dominion of Antiochus Sidetes. In his campaign against the Parthians, Antiochus Sidetes was aided by John Hyrcanus. Josephus, trying to prove the friendship of Antiochus to the Judean states that in this campaign the army rested for 2 days because of the Judeans. The account indicates that the festival of Pentecost fell on Sunday, thus immediately following a Sabbath. As the Judeans were not allowed to travel either on a Sabbath or on the day of a festival, the entire army stopped for 2 days. This statement, taken from Nicholas of Damascus, is also open to question. The Parthian campaign was a disaster. Antiochus Sidetes was defeated, and almost his entire army of 300,000 was wiped out. He himself was slain. There was hardly a family in Syria which did not suffer a bereavement, and a great lamentation arose there because of the destruction of the army. Josephus does not say that there was lamentation in Judea as a result of the destruction of the Judean army which accompanied Antiochus. Certainly, John Hyrcanus did not lead his army himself. If he had, he would have been either killed or captured by the Parthians, as were the rest of the leaders of the campaign. The Judean army was really only a token force supplied by John Hyrcanus as a sign of friendship. Josephus's story that Antiochus Sidetes ordered his entire army to rest for 2 days out of respect for the Judean Sabbath and festival must therefore be ascribed to apologetic motives. It sought to demonstrate that Antiochus Sidetes, one of the last great kings of Syria, who embodied the best qualities of the Seleucid dynasty, revered Judean law and customs, another reason why the Judeans called him Eusebius, pious. The disintegration of the Seleucid dynasty. With the death of Antiochus Sidetes, the Seleucid dynasty ceased to be an important influence in the eastern Mediterranean area. It disintegrated until it disappeared entirely when the Romans conquered all of Asia Minor. On the other hand, a new imperial power arose in the east, the Parthians. Their victory over the Syrian army led them ultimately to become the greatest antagonist of the Romans. The ancient world thus became divided between the Romans in the west and the Parthians in the east. Demetrius II now reappeared. He had been living in Parthia as a captive, but was set free by the Parthian king Phraates, or pronounced Phraates, when the Syrian attack began, so that he might harass his brother, Antiochus Sidetes. When Antiochus was killed, Demetrius II re-established himself as king of Syria. Some of the principal cities of Syria, like Antioch and Apamea, which had sided with Trypho during the civil war between him and Demetrius, still followed their old policy and remained hostile to him. Cleopatra, the sister of Ptolemy, Euergetes II, and mother-in-law of Demetrius, who had been exiled from Egypt, urged Demetrius to make war on her brother and promised to annex Egypt to Syria to make it a great empire. It had been the dream of the early Seleucid kings to make Egypt and Syria one kingdom, and it was now the only possibility for expansion since the upper lands were firmly controlled by the Parthians. Demetrius marched with an army as far as Pelusium on the border of Egypt, where he was halted by the Egyptian army. The dissatisfaction in Antioch and Apamea against Demetrius spread to other regions of the country, and he was obliged to turn back in order to restore order at home. Ptolemy now moved to take revenge upon Demetrius and, apparently, to respond to the request of the people of Antioch. He proclaimed a minor who became known as Alexander Sabinus to be the son of Alexander Belus. Other historians say he was the son of Antiochus Sidetes and a rival of Demetrius for the kingdom. The nickname Sabinus is Aramaic for the bought one, and testifies to the fact that the people knew he was not a descendant of the Seleucids. The usage also shows the prevalence of the Aramaic language in Syria. The situation in Syria, again, became as confused as it had been at the time of the civil war between Demetrius II and Trypho. Demetrius, the legitimate king, held the coast, including the city of Seleucia, while the usurpers, then Trypho, now Alexander Sabinus, were in control of the inland country, including the city of Antioch. Alexander Sabinus defeated Demetrius in battle. The latter then retreated to Ptolemais, where his wife, Cleopatra, and his children were living. But Cleopatra shut the gates of the city in his face. It is almost certain that she also instigated his assassination, which occurred while he was fleeing to Tyre. Unlike the previous civil war, when Simon aided Demetrius II, the legitimate king in opposing Trypho, John Hyrcanus, remained neutral in the new struggle. He furnished no aid either as a satellite or as an ally. For this Alexander Sabinus was grateful to him, and friendly to Judea. But the rule of Alexander Sabinus did not last long. Ptolemy had made him a pretender for the Syrian throne because of his hatred for Demetrius. Now that Demetrius was dead, Ptolemy no longer had any reason to support Alexander Sabinus, so he turned his support to his niece Cleopatra. She, after killing one of her sons, Seleucus, who was too independent for her, declared her other son by Demetrius II king. He took the name Antiochus III, but was nicknamed Grypus, the hook-nosed. Cleopatra, however, held on to the royal power. To strengthen the alliance between Egypt and Syria, Ptolemy sent one of his daughters, Cleopatra Tryphaena, to be the wife of the young Antiochus VIII. He, with the help of Ptolemy, defeated Alexander Sabinus in combat. According to one source, Alexander was slain, while another source maintains that he died by taking poison. Antiochus VIII was now nominally in sole control of the entire Seleucid kingdom. As he grew older, he became impatient of his mother's domination. Sensing that her supremacy was in jeopardy, she plotted to get rid of him. One day, when Antiochus came in, overheated from exercise, she offered him a cooling drink, but the cup contained poison. Either from suspicion or because of an earlier warning by some members of the household, he insisted that she drink first from the lethal cup. Indeed, he compelled her to do so. Thus ended the extraordinary career of a woman who had spent her life in royal marriages and political intrigues. Upon the death of Ptolemy VII in Egypt, the power was taken over by his widow Cleopatra, who was obliged to share it with her son Ptolemy VIII. Soter, nicknamed Lathyrus, Chickpea. He married one of his sisters, who was also named Cleopatra. According to Justin, he was deeply in love with her, but his mother, sensing that the young Cleopatra was a woman of determination who might have great influence over him, forced him to divorce her and marry another sister, Selene. The divorced Cleopatra, true to the traditions of her lineage, could not forgive the humiliation to which she had been subjected, and looked forward to the day when she could take revenge on the Ptolemaic court controlled by her mother Cleopatra. Antiochus VIII, Grypus, after his victory over Alexander Sabinus, and after the death of his mother Cleopatra, became the sole ruler of the remnant of the Seleucid Empire. Occupied in consolidating it, he was unable to launch an attack on John Hyrcanus. He bore John Hyrcanus great resentment, since his mortal enemy Alexander Sabinus had been friendly to John. Moreover, he was disturbed by John Hyrcanus's policy of keeping strict neutrality, which showed too much independence of Syria. It was not many years ago that his uncle Antiochus Sedites had subdued Judea, making it his satellite. Undoubtedly, Antiochus Grypus would have sought to reconquer Judea, as his uncle had done, had not another scion of the Seleucids contested the throne. The new claimant made his challenge about the year 116. He called himself Antiochus the Ninth, and was nicknamed Cyzicenus, because he was educated in the city of Cyzicus. He was a son of Cleopatra by Antiochus Sidetes. Antiochus Cyzicenus made war against his stepbrother and cousin Antiochus Grypus, allegedly because he discovered a plot by Antiochus Grypus to poison him. A new civil war flared up in Syria. Like the previous one, it was connected with the Ptolemaic dynasty. The young Cleopatra, because she had been humiliated by her mother Cleopatra, now saw an opportunity to revenge herself. She offered herself in marriage to Antiochus Cyzicenus. As dowry, she brought with her a substantial army, which he had assembled to aid him in his war against Antiochus Grypus. This civil war was fought between two half-brothers and also between two sisters, Grypus also having married one of the daughters of Ptolemy VIII. This intensified the ferocity of the struggle. Antiochus Cyzicenus succeeded in capturing the capital city of Antioch. He left his wife Cleopatra in Antioch to supervise the administration of the city. Antiochus Grypus laid siege to the city and captured it. When it fell, his wife, Tryphania, demanded that her sister Cleopatra, whom she regarded as her mortal enemy, be turned over to her so that she might be made to feel the humiliation of her defeat more keenly. But Cleopatra fled to the temple of Daphne for sanctuary. Tryphania dispatched soldiers to the temple to drag her from it. Cleopatra grasped the image of Artemis and held fast to it, but the soldiers struck her wrist off with their swords, and she died from loss of blood. Later, Antiochus Cyzicenus was victorious over his half-brother, and Tryphania fell into his hands. He put her, in turn, to death, avenging the murder of his wife, but neither of the half-brothers had the power to eliminate the other. Antiochus Grypus continued to dominate the northern part of Syria, while Antiochus Cyzicenus controlled the southern part, including Phoenicia, and the northern part of Palestine. There was also strife in Alexandria in the Ptolemaic court. Ptolemy VIII, Lathyrus, was restive under the domination of his mother Cleopatra, and this led to open clashes between them. During the civil war between the two half-brothers, Cleopatra sided with Antiochus Grypus, to whom she had given her daughter Tryphania, while Ptolemy Lathyrus was in sympathy with Antiochus Cyzicenus, whose wife was the Cleopatra he had once loved and married. The destruction of the temple on Mount Gerizim. John Hyrcanus did not sit idly by watching the civil war raging in Syria. He took advantage of the situation by capturing the border cities of Judea, knowing that neither of the contenders could prevent him from doing so. He first captured the city of Medeba, which is about 12 miles east of the Dead Sea. The siege took 6 months, but was carried through to victory because of the city's strategic location and economic importance. The latter was derived from its location near the Dead Sea, from which asphalt was obtained. The Greeks called it the Asphalt Sea. The substance was much in demand, as it was used to burnish vessels of copper, silver, and even gold. Bitumen, a product of asphalt, was also used in the embalming of the corpses, and was therefore an important item for export to Egypt. John Hyrcanus also took the city of Samaga, north of Medeba, to further protect the eastern flank of Judea. To the south he captured Marissa and Adora. This was but a beginning. The invasions of Judea by the early Seleucids had been made from the south through Idumea. In order to prevent further invasions from Egypt through Raphia, which lies in the line of Idumea, or from Syria through the southeast, he subdued the entire country of Idumea. In ancient times, when a city was conquered, the inhabitants were killed, sold into slavery, or exiled. John Hyrcanus took none of these measures against the Idumeans. They were of Semitic race, living near Judea, and undoubtedly many Judeans had settled there during the Syrian persecutions. Consequently, there had already been some accommodation between these two peoples, and many Judean customs were in vogue there. As a result, John Hyrcanus demanded that they accept Judaism and have themselves circumcised. They acceded, but became part of the Judeans. In the north, toward the end of the year 128, John captured both the city of Shechem and also Mount Gerizim, where the temple of the Samaritans, Chuthians, stood. He then destroyed this sanctuary to the great relief and joy of the Judeans. The 21st of Kislev, when the temple of Jezrim was destroyed, was declared a half-holiday. The next logical step was the conquest of Samaria, the main Samaritan city. This would completely eliminate the Samaritans as a power in the area and strengthen Judea from the north. John Hyrcanus felt unable to command the army against Samaria because of his advancing years. He appointed his sons Aristobulus and Antigonus, or pronounced Antigonus, commanders of the army, and they laid siege to the city. The Samaritans appealed for help to Antiochus Cyzicenus, who responded. Aristobulus defeated him and pursued him as far as Scythopolis, northeast of Samaria. The city originally belonged to the Israelites and was called Bet-Shean, modern Bezan. After their victory over Antiochus Cyzicenus, the Judeans continued to besiege the city. The Samaritans again appealed to Antiochus for help. Not having sufficient forces, Antiochus appealed to his friend Ptolemy Lathyrus, who sent an army of 6,000 men. He did this against the wish of his mother Cleopatra. But even with the help of Ptolemy, Antiochus did not dare openly attack the Judean army, headed by the two brothers. He began to ravage the open countryside in Judea, so that the Judean army would lift the siege of Samaria. His strategy, however, was unsuccessful, and he left the country, going to Tripoli, north of Sidon. He left two generals, Calamandras and Epicrates, in charge of the remnants of his army in Judea. They attacked the Judeans directly, and in the combat, Callimandrus was slain. According to Josephus in Antiquities, Epicrates then betrayed Scythopolis to the Judean army. But in the Jewish war, Josephus says they captured it by their own efforts. The second version of Josephus is the correct one, for the days when Scythopolis was captured were declared half holidays. It is unlikely that a holiday would have been declared had there not been a victory in the field. There is another discrepancy in Josephus's record of these events. He wrote in Antiquities that Scythopolis surrendered and that the capture of Samaria followed, while in the Jewish war he gives the reverse order. The account in the Antiquities is factual. Aristobulus and Antigonus were seasoned warriors. After the victory over Callimandrus, it would have been folly to allow the other general, Epicrates, to retreat to Scythopolis and fortify himself there, while they turned away from him to Samaria. Such tactics would have permitted Epicrates to harass them in their siege of Samaria and cause them to fight on two fronts. From a strategic point of view, the account in the Antiquities must therefore be the correct one. After the brothers defeated the army under Callimandrus, they pursued Epicrates, taking Scythopolis and overrunning the valley of Jezreel to the west. They then intensified the siege of Samaria until the city was captured. The chronology, likewise, points to this as the actual order of events. The siege of Samaria lasted a year. Both the capture of Scythopolis and Samaria are mentioned in the Megillat Tanit as furnishing occasions for half-holidays. The capture of Scythopolis and the valley of Jezreel occurred on the 15th and 16th days of Sivan, while the taking of Samaria occurred on the 25th of the month of Heshvan. It seems logical to deduce that Scythopolis was taken first in the summer of 109, and Samaria in the fall of that year. It would seem highly improbable that Samaria was taken first in the fall of 109, and that then the siege of Scythopolis was resumed in the fall, during the rainy season, so that it was finally taken in the summer of 108. Again, the account in Antiquities is confirmed. Because the Judeans suffered such great losses and underwent many sufferings during the long siege of Samaria, they wreaked bitter vengeance upon the city, razing it to the ground and turning it into a lake. Josephus states that while Aristobulus and Antigonus were carrying on the war with Antiochus Cyzicenus, their father, John Hyrcanus, was officiating in the temple. While offering incense, he heard a voice come from the Holy of Holies and say, "Thy sons have conquered Antiochus." When he left the temple, Josephus says he disclosed to the people what he had heard. A similar account is given in the Tanaitic literature. The incident was accepted as fact by the Judeans, who regarded John Hyrcanus with great esteem, even attributing to him the power of prophecy. It is at least evidence of John Hyrcanus's confidence in his sons. The achievements of John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus succeeded in establishing the Judean Commonwealth on a strong foundation and extended its borders. To the south, the country now extended almost to the kingdom of the Nabateans. He pushed the eastern frontier forward by conquering Medeba, east of the Dead Sea. To the north he added Samaria and Scythopolis, which commanded the passage of the Jordan. He even conquered a part of Lower Galilee. To the west, Jaffa, an import seaport on the Mediterranean, had already been added to Judea by his father Simon. John Hyrcanus was satisfied with his victories over the Seleucid army and confident of the stability of Judea as an independent state. He therefore abolished the Awakeners, those Levites, probably also priests, who during the Hasmonean revolt, when the Judeans were threatened with annihilation, daily recited the following hymns in the temple. Awake, why sleepest thou, Adonai? Arouse thyself, cast us not off forever. Wherefore hidest thou thy face, and forgettest our affliction and our oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust, our body cleaveth unto the earth. Arise for our help, and redeem us for thy mercy's sake. Their purpose was to appeal to God to awake and redeem the people for his mercy's sake. They also recited the following verse. Nay, but for thy sake are we killed all the day. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. In John Hyrcanus's time, the Judeans were no longer slaughtered as sheep, and their souls were no longer bowed down to the dust. They were a courageous, victorious people filled with dignity and pride. The Awakeners were no longer necessary, though their hymns were later incorporated in the book of Psalms. In the field of foreign diplomacy, too, John Hyrcanus had been highly effective. His father Simon had been compelled to take sides with one or another on the contenders for the kingdom of Syria in order to improve the status of Judea. John Hyrcanus was able to pursue an independent foreign policy. He utilized the civil wars in the Seleucid dynasty and the weakness of the Ptolemaic court to follow a diplomacy which was directed exclusively to the benefit of Judea. He maintained a friendly but independent relationship with Rome. Two other of his innovations deserve mention. He built a square citadel with thick walls called Barras, a fortress situated on the north side of the temple. He resided in the citadel and kept the vestments of the high priest there. It seems that John Hyrcanus was the first of the Hasmonean family to have coins struck. Some of the coins which have come down to us bear the inscriptions Johanan, or Johanan, the high priest, and the association of the Judeans, Heber ha-Yehudim, or Johanan, the high priest, the ruler of the association of the Judeans. The lettering was in the old Hebrew script. This was done so that the coins could circulate throughout Syria. Since the Syrians and the Nabateans spoke Aramaic, the script of which was the old Paleo-Hebrew. The split with the Pharisees. A major failure of John Hyrcanus must also be mentioned. By his brilliant victories, John Hyrcanus had enormously extended the territory of Judea, increasing his power and that of the leaders of the army. But as previously noted, he was the first Hasmonean to employ mercenaries. Hence, he and the aristocracy were no longer entirely dependent upon the will of the people. They could always call upon their mercenaries. As a result, a movement eventually rose to change the Judean form of government from a commonwealth to a monarchy. There is evidence, both in an old Tanaitic source and in the Antiquities, that John Hyrcanus, shortly before his death, contemplated becoming king. The key to understanding this conflict with the Pharisees is to be found in analyzing the famous story concerning this ambition. The Talmud relates that once at a banquet, John Hyrcanus asked the Pharisees to tell him if there was anything wrong with him. One of the extreme Pharisees, named Judah, according to Josephus he was named Eleazar, said, "Too much for you is the crown of kingship. Leave the crown of priesthood to the seed of Aaron." This version raises a number of problems. There is a discrepancy in names between the account given in the Antiquities and that in the Talmud. According to the former, the name of the ruler was John Hyrcanus, while the latter has it as Janias or Janius. However, this discrepancy can be explained by the fact that the name of Janius was applied by the rabbis to all the kings of the Second Commonwealth. The account in the Talmud goes back to an old source, as the language makes clear. The conversive waw, spelled W-A-W, that is a verb in the future tense whose meaning is converted to the past tense by prefixing the letter waw, was used here. This usage is frequently employed in the Bible, but this is the only instance of its occurrence in the Talmud. The account in the Antiquities is of a later period, most likely. Josephus took it from the writings of Most likely, Josephus took it from the writings of Nicolaus of Damascus. In writing of the Pharisees, Josephus says, "So great is their influence with the masses that even when they speak against a king or high priest, they immediately gain credence." The phrase, "a king or high priest," reveals that it could not have been written at the time of John Hyrcanus, since there were as yet no kings in Judea. Neither could it have been written in the time of Alexander Jannaeus, since the sentence recognizes a distinction between king and high priest. Therefore, it could have been written only at a time when the kings were not high priests, which was from the time of Herod onwards. All of the Talmudic passage is likewise not of great antiquity, for there are later interpolations in it. It is also important to correct another impression Josephus gives. In accounting for the conflict between the Pharisees and John Hyrcanus, Josephus said, "The envy of the Judeans was aroused against him by his own successes and those of his sons. Particularly hostile to him were the Pharisees." Again, this is most likely based on the writings of Nicholas of Damascus. The Judeans were not envious of the success of John Hyrcanus, but rather rejoiced in it. A great segment of the Judeans, including many of the Pharisees, however, opposed his design of assuming the crown as head of a monarchical form of government, especially as he was not of the family of David. They also opposed his policy of having an army of mercenaries. In addition, many of the extremists were not content that John Hyrcanus should hold the office of high priest, since he was not a scion of the family of Zadok. To continue with the banquet story, after Hyrcanus should hold the office of high priest, Question Josephus gives it in this form. Eleazar, Talmud Judah, replied, "Since you have asked to be told the truth, If you wish to be righteous, give up the high priesthood, Talmud, the crown of kingship, and be content with ruling the people. When Hyrcanus asked the reason why he should give up the high priesthood, Eleazar, Judah, replied, "Because we have heard from our elders that your mother was a captive during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes." This was an incendiary remark. Had this report been true, John Hyrcanus would have been disqualified as high priest according to the Pentateuchal law. Both sources agree that this story about his mother was fictitious, and it aroused the fury not only of John Hyrcanus but also of the Pharisees. When John Hyrcanus asked them what should be the punishment for this slander, they answered stripes and bonds. John Hyrcanus thought this punishment too mild. He expected them to say that the offender should be sentenced to death. His advisers told him that the suggestion of a mild punishment was in accordance with the leniency of the Pharisees and showed that they were in sympathy with the slanderers. He therefore broke his friendship with the Pharisees, abolished all the laws which had been promulgated by them, and joined the Sadducees. Not all the Pharisees, however, were opposed to John Hyrcanus holding the office of high priest. Most likely the rumor that his mother had been a captive at the time of the persecutions of Antiochus Epiphanes was spread by the extremists as a pretext for asking him to give up the office of high priest. When the rumor was found to be untrue, Eleazar, Judah, was treated as a slanderer. The Pharisees could not issue a verdict of death, since according to the law, slander was not a capital crime and could only be punished by stripes. The Sadducees, it will be recalled, were those who, after the Restoration, opposed Zerubbabel and the effort to establish the Judean community on a secular basis. They sought the establishment of the theocracy and favored Joshua of the family of Zadok. Hence the name Zadokites, Sadducees. Now, it is said, they supported John Hyrcanus for the high priesthood and kingship. On the surface, this would seem to be surprising. Their opposition to Zerubbabel had been due to the fear that the Persian government would suspect that if he were to become the leader, the Judeans would organize a revolt and establish an independent state. They also had opposed him because he and his followers were of the opinion that secular and religious leadership should not be vested in one man, that a high priest should be only the head of the temple, while secular leadership should be vested in a scion of the family of David. In reality, the ideology of the Sadducees had not changed in the 400 years since the Restoration. They had followed Joshua because he would serve their interest. They had been for the theocracy because it would give the high priest full authority over the Judean community. Now they supported John Hyrcanus, although he was not of the Zadokite family, because of their ideology. They, the wealthy class of Judeans, the leaders of the professional army, the landlords, saw in him their ideal ruler, who, by his military genius and statesmanship, had placed the Judean state on a firm foundation. They approved of the policy of conquest to add more territory to Judea, for they were aggressive nationalists. When John Hyrcanus deserted the Pharisees, abandoned their policies, and rejected the laws which they had enacted, that is, the laws which came through tradition, the Sadducees gladly supported him in his ambition to become king. He did not, however, assume kingship, since it is probable that he had died soon after his quarrel with the Pharisees. His son, Aristobulus became king and high priest without opposition, the army and the Sadducees being now in power. John Hyrcanus died in the summer of 105, according to the Jewish war. He had served as high priest and ruler for 31 years, according to the Antiquities, 33 years. There is, however, no contradiction between these two sources. He became high priest and ruler in the month of Shebat 136, after his father Simon was assassinated. Thus, to the summer of 105, it is a full 31 years. As the Judeans counted, however, it is 33 years, since from the month of Shebat 136 to Nisan of that year, the Judeans counted 1 year, and Nisan began the 33rd year of his rule. Thus, Antiquities could say John Hyrcanus ruled for 33 years. End of part 2.